Hi there, welcome to Solutions IRB's presentation on Expedited Category number 1. Expedited studies are studies where the research presents no more than minimal risk to subjects and involves only procedures listed in one or more of the 9 categories. Now, like I mentioned, this presentation is specifically going to focus on Category 1 of those 9 expedited categories. But a really important thing to note is that in this instance, expedited does not mean fast. Instead, expedited refers to a level of review. Now that being said, here at Solutions IRB, we are able to get these done very quickly, so send them our way. Now, one bit of confusion that we do tend to see is the difference between expedited reviews and exempt reviews. So let's dive into that. Exempt studies are listed as less than minimal risk and fit one of the 8 exempt categories. Whereas, like I just mentioned on the previous slide, expedited studies are listed as not greater than minimal risk and fit one of the 9 expedited categories. Now, on the surface, these look really similar, but the big difference is how close they get to that level of minimal risk. Exempt studies are going to be well below minimal risk, whereas expedited studies can be right at the level of minimal risk. They just cannot go over it. To really put that in perspective, let's look at some examples of exempt studies versus expedited studies. Some examples of an exempt study would be research with de-identified data, anonymous surveys, or even research conducted in commonly accepted educational settings like a classroom. Those would all be exempt studies, whereas expedited studies are just going to bump that risk up a little bit higher. So an example of them would be collection of biomedical specimens by non-invasive means. So that could be taking hair samples or nail clippings to do research. Could also be research on individual or group characteristics and behaviors. So rather than the anonymous surveys you'd see in exempt studies, these surveys might tell you a little bit more about the people and be just a little bit riskier. Again, the big difference between those two is how close they get to that level of minimal risk. But what is minimal risk? Minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research is not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. Essentially, minimal risk means that your participants are not encountering any risks or any harm higher than what they'd already see on a day-to-day basis. So keep that in mind when you're applying for an expedited review. This presentation is specifically on Expedited Category 1, so let's dive into that. Category 1 is clinical studies of drugs and medical devices only when condition A or B is met. Condition A is research on drugs for which an investigational new drug application is not required. Condition B is research on a medical device for which an investigational device exemption application is not required, or the medical device is cleared or approved for marketing and the medical device is being used in accordance with its cleared or approved labeling. Now again, in order to be an expedited review, it also has to stay at or below that level of minimal risk. So keep that in mind whether you're doing research on drugs or medical devices. In using these, your participants cannot go over the level of minimal risk, the level of risk that they encounter every day in their day-to-day lives. One example of this would be follow-up studies on a marketed medical device or drug. So this is a study that would be done well after the device or drug is already out on the market, it's already been approved and vetted, and now it's available. You can go to the store and buy it yourself. This study would be surveys of users to continue monitoring the health effects that that device or drug has on its participants. And that's a really good example of expedited category 1 because again, it's very minimal risk. You're not putting them at any more risk than they'd encounter in their day-to-day lives, but you're still able to continue the research of this medical device or drug. Something to be aware of when you're applying for an expedited study is that there's several factors that can make your expedited study get bumped up to a full board review. And really it all boils down to that minimal risk. Remember, expedited studies have to be no greater than minimal risk. So if you throw variables into your study that would cause it to go above that risk, that's when we're going to be having to do a full board review. So let's use our previous example to help us understand. Let's say you are doing a follow-up study on a drug that's been approved for use in adults, but you want to see how it works in children. Children are considered a vulnerable population, and that would automatically take your risk from minimal risk to a lot higher than that, causing us to have to do a full board review rather than the expedited study you would originally be applying for. Collecting sensitive data in your surveys could also be something that would cause you to go from an expedited study to a full board review. Again, just anything that's bumping that risk level up a little higher than minimal risk is going to cause you to need a full board review rather than expedited. So keep that in mind as you're applying for a study. Thank you for listening today. If you have any questions or would just like more information, feel free to visit our website at www.solutionsirb.com.